The air reeked of swamp rot and concrete dust as I stood at the edge of what used to be my backyard, watching Karen from the HOA scream at a city inspector while her $800,000 McMansion slowly sank another inch into the muck. Flash flood warnings blared from parked squad cars, frogs croaked from front lawns, and somewhere across the swampy hellscape, a rusted mailbox bobbed past like a funeral float. Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how we got here. I never thought a skinny little creek winding through my backyard would turn into a declaration of war. But that's exactly what happened. For years, that trickle of water was my refuge, my reward. After long days welding pipes and crawling under houses for a living, I'd sit in an old folding chair next to the creek, beer in one hand, fishing pole in the other. Though I never caught anything bigger than a curious bluegill, dragonflies zipped through the tall reeds. The air smelled like wet grass, and the only sound at night was the gentle burble of water weaving through the rocks. It was the kind of peace you didn't mess with. Then came the HOA. Technically, the HOA had existed on the other side of the development for years, all tucked away in their identical beige houses with matching mailboxes and suspiciously synchronized porch pumpkins every October. We, on the creek side, were the old-timers, the leftovers from when this place was nothing but fields and dirt roads. But lines were redrawn, neighborhoods annexed, and before we could blink, the HOA had slithered its way into our lives like an oil spill. I got my first taste of their nonsense when a woman named Karen Mitchell showed up on my porch one muggy Saturday morning, clipboard clutched to her chest like a medieval shield. She wore pastel workout gear despite clearly not working out, and her smile had the same warmth as a tax audit. She introduced herself as the HOA Community Standards Chair, and I introduced myself as busy. But that didn't stop her. She had concerns about my property, more specifically about my creek. According to her, it was an unauthorized water feature that posed a significant safety hazard to neighborhood children and wildlife. I stared at her like she'd just accused my cat of running a Ponzi scheme. The creek was natural, had been there long before any of us showed up with our mortgages and zero-turn mowers. It was as much a part of the land as the trees and the rocks. Karen didn't care. Karen had rules. Rules about fencing water features, rules about standing water, rules about aesthetics. Rules, rules, rules. I politely informed her that the creek was a protected natural drainage, according to my deed and county regulations. But she just scribbled something furiously on her clipboard and huffed away, leaving the smell of expensive perfume and pure rage hanging in the air. 2 days later, I got my first violation notice stuck to my door with blue painter's tape. It accused me of unauthorized landscape elements, unsafe open water, and attracting non-native species, because apparently frogs now counted as foreign invaders. I ignored it. A week after that, I got a second notice, this time threatening fines of $100 per day unless I submitted a plan for bringing my property into compliance. I wrote back a simple letter quoting county codes and attached a copy of the land survey showing the creek's status. They responded by scheduling a mandatory inspection. That inspection turned out to be 3 people I'd never seen before, wandering around my backyard with tape measures and smartphones, snapping photos like they were building a case against me for war crimes. Karen supervised from the edge of my property, tapping her toes impatiently as I stood there, arms crossed, daring them to step 1 inch into the creek itself. They didn't, but they made plenty of notes. A week later, at the mandatory HOA meeting that I had absolutely no intention of attending. Until that point, Karen stood up in front of a crowd of mostly disinterested neighbors and declared my creek an imminent safety hazard. She cited insurance risks, wildlife attraction, mosquito breeding, and the potential for future erosion compromising nearby properties. The irony of calling a natural creek a hazard while living next to a marshy swamp was apparently lost on her. When I stood up to argue, she smiled sweetly and handed me a packet of paperwork, demanding I either fence the entire creek, fill it in, or submit to weekly HOA inspections for the next year. At my own expense, I told her and the entire room exactly where she could stick her paperwork, politely. Of course, after that, things got worse. I started finding anonymous complaints about my overgrown landscape and failure to maintain property standards on my door every other day. My mailbox was mysteriously knocked off its post. One morning, someone dumped a pile of landscaping rocks into the shallow end of the creek, making it back up a little and pool against the banks. I caught Karen herself one afternoon taking pictures of my yard from inside her SUV, parked across the street with the engine running like some sort of suburban private investigator. I refused to budge. I kept the creek natural, kept the reeds trimmed, kept the flow clear. It was my land, my water, and my damn right to sit next to it in peace. I should have known they wouldn't stop there. It happened early on a Wednesday morning. I was sipping my coffee on the back porch when I heard the low rumble of heavy equipment. At first, I thought it was city workers fixing the pothole up on Maple Drive. But the sound got closer, much closer. I stood up just in time to see a small cement truck backing slowly down the side alley between my house and the next. A man in a neon vest and hard hat was guiding it like he was parking a Ferrari. Shouting to the driver over the growl of the engine, I sprinted down the steps and across the yard just as they positioned the chute directly over the upper curve of my creek. "Hey!" I shouted, waving my arms. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The guy in the vest barely glanced at me. "Just following work orders, sir. Drainage mitigation project approved by the HOA." Before I could get another word out, the chute swung down and a thick gray slurry of wet concrete began pouring into the creek. I lost it. I charged forward, but slipped in the muddy grass and went down hard on my side, scraping my arm. By the time I scrambled back to my feet, the cement was already spreading like a toxic ooze, coating the pebbles, drowning the reeds, suffocating the water itself. Frogs leapt desperately away from the flow, but some were too slow, trapped in the sticky mess as it hardened. The driver kept the drums spinning, casually filling the entire upper bend with thick gray sludge, while the vest guy checked his clipboard and nodded approvingly. I screamed at them to stop, to show me paperwork, to get off my land. But they just ignored me. By the time they finished and pulled away, my beautiful creek had been reduced to a grotesque concrete scar, a silent, lifeless ditch that stretched from one end of the yard to the other. A slow rage settled into my bones as I stood there, dripping mud and blood, staring at the smoking ruins of what had once been the soul of my home. Karen watched from the sidewalk, arms crossed, smiling like she'd just won a game of chess. She thought I didn't even know we were playing. I wiped the mud from my eyes, straightened up, and smiled right back. Let her have this round. She had no idea what kind of storm she'd just unleashed. The first rain was almost a relief after the summer. We had a heavy sheet of gray rolling in from the west, drenching the baked streets of our neighborhood in a welcome flood of cool water. I sat on my porch and watched it come, arms crossed, coffee growing cold in my hands as thick drops hammered the roof and turned the lawn into a muddy sponge. Normally, the creek would have handled it without complaint, its little gurgling mouth swallowing the runoff and carrying it downstream like it had done for longer than any of us had lived here. But this time, there was no creek to catch it. Only a long concrete scar, hard and slick and useless. I watched the water hit the concrete channel, swirl uncertainly, and then begin to back up, pooling across the lawn and into the low spots, like an old man trying to remember his way home. Within an hour, puddles stretched across my backyard like ugly gray bruises. By noon, the sidewalk out front was ankle-deep in murky runoff, small pieces of mulch and trash spinning in lazy circles where the storm drains clogged. Across the street, Karen Mitchell stood on her porch with an umbrella the size of a beach tent, watching with thin-lipped satisfaction as water lapped at the curbs and flower beds. It took only 2 storms for the first real problems to appear. Mrs. Jensen at the ED corner house woke up to find her basement carpet squishing under her feet. Mr. Alvarez had to sandbag his front door when a river of runoff poured down the slope of his yard straight toward his porch. The gutters on Maple Drive overflowed so badly that the whole cul-de-sac turned into a stagnant pond, trapping a couple of unlucky cars up to their wheel wells in dirty brown soup. And every single time, the HOA sent out a notice blaming the homeowners: improper lawn grading, clogged personal drains, failure to maintain property water runoff according to HOA standards. It was never their fault. Not once did Karen or her cronies mention the fact that by pouring concrete into the natural drainage path, they'd crippled the entire runoff system. It was as if the creek had never existed, wiped from their memories the way you might erase a guilty footprint from a crime scene. I said nothing publicly. I went to the meetings, nodded politely when they showed satellite photos with red circles around problem areas, watched as they passed new emergency measures requiring mandatory property drainage inspections, which, coincidentally, cost $250 per household. I played the fool, but inside, I documented everything. Every storm. I walked the neighborhood with my old Nikon camera slung around my neck, pretending to be a hobbyist photographer while quietly snapping hundreds of photos. Flooded yards, submerged mailboxes, water pooling along the newly landscaped common areas. I kept a notebook, too, filled with times, dates, locations, and notes about which homes were affected worst. I even started flying my old drone after the bigger storms, capturing aerial shots of the way the water flowed, or, more accurately, failed to flow. Nobody seemed to notice. They were too busy bickering. Because as the water problems got worse, so did the tension between neighbors. Mrs. Jensen accused the Alvarez kids of blocking the storm drain with a soccer ball. The Hendersons blamed the Patels for installing a new flower bed that supposedly redirected runoff onto their lawn. People who'd once shared beers and barbecue recipes now filed formal complaints against each other for deliberate water mismanagement. The HOA naturally leaned into it. They appointed Karen to head up a new flood mitigation task force, which mostly seemed to involve her writing ever more aggressive violation letters and pushing through emergency fines with 0 votes. Meanwhile, the actual drainage infrastructure continued to rot under the pressure. The few storm drains we had were never meant to handle the full runoff of our area without the natural creek doing its job. They choked under the weight of the storms like a man trying to breathe through a straw. The streets cracked, lawns washed away, mold crept up the sides of garage doors, and still, somehow, the blame always seemed to land at the feet of the residents. I heard one neighbor muttering bitterly at the mailbox one morning that maybe Karen ought to be fined for not controlling the weather. The sarcasm was getting thicker than the floodwater. I said nothing, just nodded sympathetically and tucked another set of printed photos into my growing evidence file. It wasn't just the water that was rising, it was resentment, thick and ugly, building pressure under the surface of our tidy neighborhood, like steam under a cracked kettle lid. You could feel it in the way people avoided each other's eyes at HOA meetings, the way whispered conversations cut off abruptly when certain board members walked past. And Karen? Well, Karen seemed to thrive on it. She strutted around in her HOA badge like it was a sheriff's star, relishing every new complaint, every new fine levied against homes she didn't like. She even made a special visit to my door one afternoon, fake smiling and informing me that, due to ongoing drainage issues, I was required to submit a full landscaping plan for review by the end of the month. I asked if the plan needed to account for the literal wall of concrete they'd poured into my property without my permission, but she just blinked slowly and said that any alterations to the current drainage structures were subject to further fines. I signed the paperwork with a smile, took her official-looking form, and added it to my ever-thickening binder of ammunition. Let them bury themselves. I was patient. I had time. And I knew something they didn't. Nature doesn't forget. Water doesn't forgive. And concrete, for all its smug permanence, can't stand forever against the simple, unstoppable persistence of rain and gravity. It wouldn't be long now. The cracks were already showing if you knew where to look. I saw it in the slow but steady sink of Mr. Alvarez's retaining wall, in the widening puddle that never quite dried up at the base of the Hendersons' driveway, in the way Mrs. Jensen's front lawn looked suspiciously tilted toward the street after the last big storm. The earth was moving, imperceptibly at first, like a cat shifting its weight before a pounce, but moving all the same. All because they'd tried to pave over something that was never meant to be controlled. I kept my head down, kept my mouth shut, kept my camera batteries charged, because it wasn't just me they'd wronged anymore, it was all of us. And when the dam finally broke, I intended to have a front-row seat. The third week of rain started like a drum roll, soft at first, barely a whisper against the window panes. Then it gathered strength, swelling into a full-throated roar that turned the skies black and the air thick with the smell of wet earth and ozone. The weather reports flashed warnings on every station, calling it a 100-year storm, a freak convergence of cold fronts and saturated ground. But out here in the neighborhood, it just felt like Judgment Day. The streets became rivers overnight, asphalt disappearing under swirling gray currents flecked with bits of sod and shattered mulch. Manhole covers burped brown geysers into the air. Gutters ripped free from the sides of houses with sharp metallic groans. The water, too much for the flimsy construction to handle. Lawns disappeared beneath dirty lakes that shimmered under the streetlights like glass and oil. And the houses, God help them! The houses began to crack. It started small. Hairline fractures spidering across driveways and walkways, easy enough to ignore if you squinted or chalked it up to settling. But then the real damage surfaced. Long, jagged fissures climbing up stucco walls like lightning scars, door frames warping until front doors refused to latch, garage floors buckling as the earth beneath them shifted inside. I watched it all unfold from my porch. The same folding chair, the same battered thermos of coffee, a silent sentinel bearing witness as nature reclaimed what it was owed. Across the street, Karen Mitchell stood in ankle-deep water, screaming into her cell phone, gesturing wildly at the lake that had consumed her prize-winning rose bushes and was now licking the steps of her front porch. Her perfect suburban utopia was dissolving into a swamp, and she couldn't stop it. She tried, of course. The HOA scrambled like ants from a kicked nest, throwing together emergency meetings in the community center, passing out sandbags from the back of a rented U-Haul, issuing urgent emails blaming everything from clogged city drains to unusually high tides. Welcome to another chapter in the HOA Tragedies saga, where a natural creek becomes a battleground and a neighborhood learns the cost of paving over nature's will. They brought in a landscaping company that specialized in rapid water remediation, which mostly meant dumping gravel into the worst puddles and hoping for the best. Karen herself spearheaded a campaign accusing the city of negligence, filing complaints, threatening lawsuits, ranting about how their tax dollars entitled them to better drainage systems. But the truth hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, because anyone with eyes could see where the problem started. It started where the creek had once been. It started in my backyard. And so, of course, the blame shifted again. First, it was whispered among the HOA board members during emergency sessions. Then it appeared in passive-aggressive emails sent to all residents. Finally, Karen made it official, marching up to my porch one afternoon with a clipboard and a violation notice thicker than a phone book. Negligent property maintenance, failure to install proper drainage structures, contribution to neighborhood flooding. Her voice trembled with barely contained rage as she read the accusations aloud, water still dripping from the hem of her designer raincoat. I listened patiently, sipping my coffee, nodding at all the appropriate times, letting her vent every ounce of her frustration and fear and fury. I signed nothing. I said almost nothing. I just smiled, that slow smile that made her eyes narrow with suspicion, because I knew something she didn't. I had known it for weeks now, sitting quietly on the knowledge like a trap-door spider, waiting for the right moment. They thought they'd erase the creek with a few yards of concrete and some paperwork. But creeks, real creeks, are stubborn things. They're written into the bones of the land, etched deeper than any human survey or HOA covenant. The water hadn't disappeared. It had simply gone underground, seeping through the soil, following its old paths, saturating the ground layer by layer until it could no longer be ignored. The foundations were cracking not because of clogged drains or heavy rain alone. They were cracking because the earth itself was shifting, swollen with trapped water, straining against the unnatural barriers humans had foolishly erected. And I had proof. Tucked away in my files were the drone photos showing the initial minor pooling, the aerial maps showing the slow, inevitable migration of the water toward the lower-lying homes, the city floodplain maps that had never been updated after the HOA's illegal creek modification, even a few quiet conversations I'd recorded with contractors and surveyors who confirmed, off the record, that the changes made by the HOA violated several county drainage codes. But I wasn't ready to spring the trap just yet. No, this had to get worse. It had to hurt. It had to break them. And judging by the rising tension in the neighborhood, we were almost there. You could feel it, like the thick electric hum before a thunderstorm, in the way neighbors glared at each other across flooded sidewalks, in the way voices rose sharp and angry at HOA meetings, in the way the once pristine lawns now sagged under the weight of mud and resentment. Karen sensed it too. She doubled down on enforcement, issuing new regulations, new fines, new inspections. She organized a neighborhood improvement committee, tasked with identifying homes that were contributing to the aesthetic decline of the community. And guess whose name was at the top of that list? I smiled when the notice arrived. 3 pages of vague accusations and thinly veiled threats. I added it to my growing binder, careful to slip a copy into the waterproof container I'd buried at the base of the old oak tree out back. Just in case, because people like Karen, once they felt the ground slipping from under them, tended to get desperate. And desperate people made mistakes. Big ones. All I had to do was be patient. And the land itself would do the heavy lifting. It was already happening. You could see it in the sagging frames of once proud entryways, the bowed fences, the cracked retaining walls. You could hear it in the nervous chatter at the coffee shop, the whispers at the mailboxes, the not-so-subtle for sale signs popping up faster than mushrooms after a storm. The neighborhood was rotting from the inside out, just like Karen's paper empire of rules and regulations, and still, somehow, she thought she could find me into submission. She thought this was about me. That was her fatal mistake. This wasn't about me. It was about the land, about the water, about forces older and stronger and infinitely more patient than she could ever comprehend. And very soon, she was going to learn that lesson the hard way. The heavy envelope had sat at the bottom of my filing cabinet for years, tucked between yellowed manuals and a cracked box of Christmas lights I never hung. I found it the night after Karen dropped the latest violation notice on my doorstep, her smug grin still fresh in my memory. It had been pure stubbornness that drove me into the garage that night, flashlight clenched between my teeth, rifling through old boxes until I found the battered blue folder my grandfather had given me when he signed over the property. "Might be useful someday," he'd said, and then promptly refused to explain. I pried the envelope open with the edge of a screwdriver and found a treasure trove inside. Original land surveys dating back to 1952. A certified letter from the County Water Authority, dated 1978, confirming a permanent natural drainage easement running directly through what was now my backyard. Copies of state environmental protection orders recognizing the creek as part of a protected watershed. In other words, hard, official proof that my little creek wasn't just a pretty feature, but a legally protected drainage route. One that no homeowners association, no matter how drunk on power, had the right to fill, block, reroute, or otherwise tamper with. And that was exactly what they'd done when they poured concrete into it. I sat back on the cold concrete floor, the documents spread out like a hand of winning cards, and let out a long, slow breath. They'd screwed up royally, but proving it would take more than just waving these papers around at the next HOA meeting. I needed the right people to see them. People with badges, people with clipboards, people who could shut Karen down the way a dam shuts down a river. So I made some calls, first to the County Water Authority, requesting a property inspection due to suspected unauthorized modification of natural drainage systems, then to the City Environmental Office, framing it as a concern for potential wetland violations. I used my real name, gave my real property details, but carefully left out any mention of the HOA for now. Let them find the smoking gun themselves. While the bureaucratic wheels began to turn, I got to work on the second part of my plan, anonymous whistleblowing. It was surprisingly easy. A burner email account, a carefully crafted message explaining the situation, complete with aerial drone photos, time-stamped pictures of the concrete pour, copies of the old easement documents and links to county code violations. I sent it to every local news station, the city newspaper, a couple of popular suburban Facebook groups, and, just for fun, the HOA gossip forum that Karen had banned me from last year. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, a white county truck rolled slowly down my street, followed by a second vehicle bearing the city seal. 2 inspectors got out, one carrying a clipboard, the other shouldering what looked like a surveyor's tripod. They crunched across the muddy sidewalk, carefully avoiding the flooded yards, and came straight to my front door. I invited them in, offered them coffee, and laid out the entire history in calm, measured tones, backed by hard evidence. They listened, asked a few pointed questions, and then spent the next 4 hours meticulously inspecting the creek area, measuring the concrete fill, taking soil samples, and snapping photos from every angle. I watched from my porch as they made notes, conferred quietly, frowned a lot, and finally shook their heads grimly before getting back into their trucks. Later that night, the first news story hit, a short segment on the evening news, a grainy aerial shot of our neighborhood floating on a lake of muddy water, while the reporter explained that unauthorized modifications to natural drainage systems had worsened, flooding and possibly violated multiple environmental protections. They didn't name the HOA yet, but it was only a matter of time. The next morning, I found a certified letter crammed into my mailbox, an official notice of investigation. It was addressed to the HOA, but of course, Karen already knew. The way she stormed into the emergency board meeting that afternoon told me everything. I stayed just long enough to watch her march up to the podium, cheeks flushed, hair frizzed from the rain, and slam a thick stack of papers down in front of the shell-shocked board members. She ranted about slander, about false accusations, about rogue residents sabotaging the community. She accused the county of overreach, the city of corruption, the media of bias. She accused everyone but herself. Meanwhile, behind her, the projector screen flickered to life, showing images that had clearly been pulled from the whistleblower packet. Photos of the concrete truck pouring into my creek. Maps of the natural easement running straight through my property. Screenshots of the county codes they'd violated in bold red text. The room went silent, except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Even the board members, normally quick to nod along with Karen's every decree, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting to each other, to the floor. Anywhere but at her. She was cornered, and she knew it. But Karen was nothing if not stubborn. She doubled down, claimed the concrete was a temporary erosion control measure, insisted that the HOA had the right to beautify common areas, even hinted that she had verbal permission from someone at the county to make improvements. But when one of the quieter board members timidly asked for written proof, Karen's mouth snapped shut like a steel trap, because there was none, and she knew it. That night, the second wave of news coverage hit, this time much harsher. Words like illegal, reckless, and potential civil and criminal penalties were thrown around with relish. Several residents were interviewed, some on camera, expressing their outrage, their fears about property values, their concerns about mold and foundation damage. A local environmental watchdog group picked up the story and started circulating a petition demanding a full investigation and restitution for affected homeowners. Within a week, the county posted official violation notices on the community center doors. City inspectors began knocking on doors, not to issue HOA fines, but to conduct property inspections related to flooding and foundation integrity. Lawsuits started brewing in the background, rumors spreading like wildfire that several homeowners were planning to sue both the HOA and individual board members for negligence and property damage. And at the center of the storm stood Karen, desperately trying to plug the leaks in a ship that was already halfway underwater. She tried to rally her loyalists, the few die-hard rule followers who still believed in the righteousness of HOA governance, but their numbers dwindled with every soggy basement and cracked wall. She tried to spin the narrative, claiming victimhood, alleging conspiracies. But nobody was buying it anymore. The neighbors who once nodded along to her tirades now crossed the street to avoid her. The board meetings, once packed with sycophants, now barely scraped together a quorum. Her kingdom was crumbling, and she had no idea how to stop it. I watched it all unfold from my porch, sipping my coffee, flipping through the growing stack of news articles and legal notices with quiet satisfaction. Because Karen might have had the HOA by the throat once, but now the county, the city, the news, and the law had her by the ankles, dragging her down 1 inch at a time. She'd built her empire on arrogance and asphalt, poured her false confidence into concrete. And in doing so, she'd forgotten the most basic rule of all. Nature always wins. And this time, it was going to win in spectacular fashion. The first set of city citations hit like a thunderclap. Thick envelopes crammed into every HOA board member's mailbox, each bearing the grim weight of official government letterhead and legal language sharp enough to cut steel. Karen's face when she opened hers was something I'd have paid good money to see. But the real show came later that afternoon, when the city posted red tags on the front doors of a dozen homes, including hers. Unsafe structure, unstable foundation, immediate occupancy restrictions pending remediation. In plain English, their dream houses had been declared unfit to live in. I sat on my porch and watched as families stood dumbstruck in the rain, staring at the bright orange warning placards like they couldn't quite process what was happening. Moving vans clogged the streets within days, engines rumbling as bewildered homeowners scrambled to save what they could from houses that had begun sinking into the earth like slow-motion shipwrecks. Karen tried to fight it, of course. She hired a lawyer, threatened to sue the city, screamed at the inspectors in her driveway until her voice cracked. But it was no use. The damage was too obvious, the evidence too overwhelming, the paper trail of negligence too thick to ignore. The final nail came from the insurance companies. When the first claims rolled in for water damage, Foundation collapse and mold remediation. The adjusters swooped in like vultures and pecked the corpses clean. Act of negligence, they said. Policy violations? Failure to maintain proper drainage structures. Denied, denied, denied. No payouts, no repairs, no hope. Without insurance money, the homeowners were trapped. Their properties worthless. Their mortgages bleeding them dry. Foreclosure notices started appearing in windows like paper ghosts. Karen's own home, once the pride of the neighborhood with its manicured hedges and faux Greek columns, was the first to be condemned outright. By the end of the month, she was living in a borrowed RV parked at the far end of the development, the wheels slowly sinking into the same mud she'd unleashed. The HOA collapsed not long after. At the emergency meeting held in the gutted shell of the community center, the handful of remaining residents voted to dissolve the organization entirely. No fanfare, no speeches, just a simple majority raised in bitter, rain-soaked hands. Karen tried to object, but nobody even bothered to argue. She was finished, and she knew it. The final financial report was read aloud in a voice so hollow it might as well have been a funeral dirge. Over $2.3 million in projected legal liabilities, 0 assets. Bankruptcy imminent. A motion was made, seconded, and approved to dissolve the HOA effective immediately. Karen was last seen dragging boxes of shredded documents out of the community center under the watchful eye of a city marshal. But the story didn't end there, because even as the HOA died its well-deserved death, the neighborhood faced a choice. Try to patch up the broken system the old way, or return to the land's original wisdom. The vote to restore the natural drainage passed with almost no opposition. The County Environmental Office offered grants for watershed restoration. Volunteers lined up to help. Even some of the displaced homeowners who'd once snubbed me offered to pitch in. For weeks, we dug, shoveled, and planted, peeling back the concrete scars to reveal the soft, thirsty earth beneath. We rerouted the water along its old path, not with pipes and pumps and asphalt, but with native grasses and willow trees and carefully placed stones. The first time the creek flowed again, clear and laughing through my backyard, it was like hearing an old friend call my name after a long absence. I sat beside it, legs dangling in the cool rush of water, and smiled as the dragonflies returned. The frogs croaked in the reeds, and the land itself seemed to exhale in relief. But I wasn't quite finished. One sunny morning, while the neighborhood bustled with the sounds of rebuilding and renewal, I planted a small wooden sign at the head of the creek, where it curved into my property. I carved the letters myself with a whittling knife, slow and deliberate, until the message stood out clean and bold for anyone passing by to see. Nature always wins. It wasn't spite. It wasn't gloating. It was truth, pure and simple. For all their rules and fines and concrete and arrogance, they'd forgotten the oldest law of all, that no matter how high you build your walls, no matter how many papers you sign or stamps you press, you cannot conquer the land forever. It remembers. It waits. And when the time is right, it reclaims what is its own. Karen left the neighborhood shortly after that, towing her battered RV behind a rusted pickup truck with a cracked rear window. No farewell party, no parade, just a few curious glances and a lot of relieved sighs. The house she once lorded over now sat abandoned, half swallowed by the very swamp she'd helped create. A monument to hubris and stupidity. The new families who moved in never asked much about the past. They saw the restored creek, the lush wetlands, the healthy trees and thriving gardens, and they were content to let the land tell its own story. A better story, a lasting one. Every so often, I still find myself sitting by the creek, watching the water dance over the stones, listening to the frogs sing at sunset, feeling the earth solid and sure beneath my boots. I run my fingers over the rough wood of the sign and smile to myself because I know what it cost to win this peace. And I know that no matter what comes next, No matter who tries to tame it or own it or reshape it, the land will endure. It will remember. It will win. Just like it always has, welcome to another chapter in the HOA Tragedies saga, where one man's fight for his creek taught a neighborhood the power of nature's patience.